Great, Steve, thank you. Thank you all for coming and for tuning in to watch this. I'm a geologist, and I know fully well that you are never supposed to call soil dirt. This is partly why I called my book Dirt. Why? Well, I'm not that good at following directions, first of all. And secondly, if you look at what has happened to soils worldwide over the course of the agricultural era, the last 7, 8, 9, 10,000 years or so, we have turned an awful lot of soil into dirt. We've moved it off of productive agricultural fields and put it places where it was not so productive. Thus the title. But I'll make no apologies for the title, despite having been taught explicitly in soil science class to never ever call soil dirt. But why would a geologist like myself spend the time to actually write a whole book about the way that people treated land and how that has affected societies in the past? It's because in studying erosional processes, the processes that shape topography, because I'm the kind of geologist that's known as a geomorphologist. I study the shaping and sculpting of topography. And you can't get away from the processes of erosion and the movement of sediment around the landscape. And over the course of my career, I've come to actually realize that soil is a strategic resource. It's every bit as much a strategic resource as the things that we tend to think of. Oil on a geopolitical basis, water, as we heard the other day in terms of future, the atmosphere in terms of what's happening to the climate. Soil is essentially the global environmental crisis that's happening slowly enough that we don't tend to talk about it or focus on it to the level that it actually deserves in terms of its status and magnitude as quite literally sort of a quiet global crisis. So if we think of soil as a strategic resource and we look at the pattern of soil degradation in the world today, and taking a map from the UN, there's an awful lot of regions of the world where agricultural soils have been degraded to one degree or another. And you'll notice there's an awful lot of red and orange areas on that map, areas where soil has been degraded or very degraded. And there's some areas where the soils are not so degraded. But one thing I want to point out at the start of this talk is, although I'll be talking a lot about soil degradation as a global problem, you could look at any of those red areas on that map and find individual farms or even a number of farms where farmers are intensively working the land to produce food, but actually improving the quality of the soil. So this kind of a map, this kind of global analysis, a lot of what I'll be talking about is painting with a fairly broad brush, and by the end of the talk, what I want to get to are some promising developments in terms of the way we can actually turn around the long-term degradation of soils that is, as I'll be talking about, characterized many societies throughout history. So if we look at what the magnitude of the soil degradation problem really is, David Pimental and colleagues a while back now wrote in a review that over the past 40 years, which writing in the 1990s, that meant in the post-World War II era, soil erosion caused the degradation of some 430 million hectares of land worldwide. That's an area that's about the size of India and China combined, about 1/3 of all present cropland. That's land that we've degraded the agricultural potential for. And if you think about the problem of feeding the world 50 or 100 years out, it would sure be useful to have all the potentially available farmland in the world at full productive capacity. We've already degraded a lot of it. It can, I think, in the end be reversed and undone, but it could take a while, and it will definitely take focused energy and changed policies. But how big a problem is this in terms of rates? At the same time, they were estimating that the estimated world rate of soil erosion was on the order of 23 billion tons a year or so. That's a net loss of under 1%, about 0.5% to 1% a year of soil and cropland that is being degraded. Now, to most people, a rate of less than 1% a year is pretty small. That's not a terribly big annual return on anything or loss of anything. But thinking like a geologist, if you just take that number of 0.75% or so and play that out over time, it only takes about 150 years or so to project out that we'd be literally running out of topsoil off the world's croplands. And if you take the high end of the estimates, it would be even sooner. Now, I'm not going to argue to you today that I think that the world is going to run out of soil. But what I will argue to you today is that the pace at which we've been degrading agricultural soils over the last several centuries is quite transparently not sustainable. And what I think that means is that agriculture is going to change over the next century. It will need to change as the human population keeps rising. We simply cannot afford to continue degrading farmland. We're going to have to figure out how to farm intensively while building and maintaining soil fertility at the same time. And I think we could do that. Now, if we think about the problem of maintaining a civilization over the long run, there's really no mystery to the idea that some of the key controls in the longevity of human societies are things like climate changes, natural disasters, politics, wars, social evolution, the kind of things that we would read in history textbooks. Now, if you look at the climate change issue in terms of societies in the past, there are droughts in antiquity that took out dynasties in ancient Egypt. There was the cold snap of the Little Ice Age that did in the Viking colony in Greenland. There's absolutely no controversy over whether climate changes in the past have influenced the longevity of human societies. In terms of natural disasters, well, similarly, there's no real controversy that natural disasters can affect human societies. If you look at the Greek island of Santorini and the Bronze Age civilization that was there, they lived in an active volcano, kind of like I've got Mount St. Helens up there on the screen in my home state of Washington to illustrate volcanoes. That's not Santorini. But what is it about natural disasters and volcanoes in particular in this example that could influence the longevity of a society? Well, back to the island of Santorini, they built on an active volcano. Why would they do that? They had geothermally plumbed hot water in the Bronze Age. It was one of the most advanced civilizations in the Mediterranean at their time, but they had absolutely terrible land use planning. They built on an active volcano. When their homeland erupted out from under them, it was game over for their island kingdom. Now, if you think about the influence of natural disasters on societies, though, there's sort of a scale dependence to them. A small island state on a single volcano is very vulnerable to disruption when that volcano erupts. A large dispersed global society can, at least in principle, take aid from one area that's unaffected by natural disasters and bring it to areas that are affected. And so there's a scale dependence to the dependence of natural disasters, unless, of course, something like the event that took out the dinosaurs 65 million years ago is repeated at a global scale and Bruce Willis is unavailable to save the world. In terms of politics, wars, and social evolution, I mean, that's the stuff you see in history textbooks, right? I mean, you crack open an environmental history textbook or any textbook, and those are the things that really make the stuff of history. And I'm not arguing that those things don't matter. Clearly, they do to the course and fate of human societies. But the question that I want to ask, that I wrestled with in writing this book, was the question of what about the soil? We know that the fundamental condition for maintaining an agricultural civilization is sustaining the soil itself as a physical body on the landscape and the fertility of that soil. Something like 90+% of our food comes directly or indirectly from the soil. Most major civilizations have been agricultural civilizations, and we know that that is a factor. How big a factor was that in the history of human societies? That's the question that I grappled with in trying to write this book. And given the title of it, I've probably already given away my opinion about it. But I want to walk you through some of the examples and a little bit of the data, some of the history, and how we might actually turn the long-term problem of soil erosion and degradation around. Now, if you look in environmental history textbooks in particular, you'll find the argument that soil erosion from deforestation helps to explain the demise of civilizations around the world. All those societies over on the right-hand side of the screen are places where that argument has been made. But as a geologist who's worked on erosional processes in upland environments, in mountain regions and hilly regions that are prone to erode rapidly upon deforestation, I noticed some other things that kind of complicate the argument that you tend to find in environmental history textbooks. And that is, quite frankly, that trees grow back fairly rapidly. I've worked in coastal Oregon now where there's been several cycles of timber harvesting over the last 100 years, and we've been able to document greatly increased rates of landsliding, but off of very small areas of the landscape. The numbers simply don't pencil out in terms of a broad region to look at the pace at which you could explain the wholesale loss of the soil over large regions. And this started me to wonder whether it wasn't simply a question of deforestation as the driver behind the erosion that has that imperiled many civilizations, but whether it was the agriculture that followed, whether it was the plow and not the axe that actually was the culprit in taking out much of the soil that much of the soil loss that caused much of the soil loss that plagued a lot of ancient societies. So the question that I wanted to wrestle with in this book is, could agricultural erosion and degradation limit the lifespan of civilizations? And again, I've probably given away the answer in the title of the book, but I want to share with you some of those stories and some of the data and let you come to your own conclusion. And if you look at recent archaeological studies, there's a lot of work where people have done both the geology and the archaeology, what we refer to as the geoarchaeology, where geologists and archaeologists work together to understand what was happening to the population of a landscape and how that was affecting the land itself at the same time, and trying to put that interdisciplinary perspective together on it. And those studies have been done that showed that soil erosion played a role in the demise of ancient civilizations, ranging from Neolithic Europe, Bronze Age Europe, to classical Greece, Rome, the southern United States, areas in Central America. The list actually goes on. I tried to document as many of those as I could find in putting the book together. I'll spare you all the details today because I could be talking till midnight about that. But there's a number of studies where people have put those perspectives together, and I'll want to share with you some of the commonalities, a few of the stories from it, and some of the commonalities in terms of what you can learn by putting it all together. And the simplest way I could put that is essentially to invite you to think about soil the way a geologist or a geomorphologist like myself thinks about soil. You can think about it as a system, as something that's produced from the weathering of rocks, as rocks break down and are converted into smaller fragments and chemically converted from the primary minerals that the rocks are formed with to the secondary minerals, clays, that plant nutrients are more easily liberated out from. That weathering process combines with the merging of with biological material, organic matter, dead things. And that makes it a healthy, fertile soil. It's essentially the bridge between geology and biology, between the sort of the dead inert world of the interior of the earth and the living fringe that we're a part of. And so there's this pace at which soils are produced from the weathering and breakdown of rocks and the merging with biological material, with organic matter, to make a soil. And if you're on any kind of a slope, erosional processes are going to be removing that material at the same time. So you have this balance between the production of soil and the local loss and removal of soil. And if you think about soil as a system that way, something that's produced, something that can be lost, and something that is stored on a hillside, you can start thinking of soil on a hillside as essentially nature's bank account. It's nature's capital. It's essentially a storage. You build it up when soil production, the weathering, exceeds the pace of erosion, and you start to draw it down when the erosion exceeds the pace of soil production and reformation. In other words, soil is just like your bank account. If you spend money at a pace faster than you make it, and you do it for too long, you will run out of money. Having done this several times myself, I can vouch for you that theory is true. And if you think about this at the scale of whole societies, that same argument is true for human civilizations in regard to the most fundamental resource we need for agriculture, which is healthy, fertile soil. So if you think about soil the way a geologist does, the time scales are different than your bank account, yes, but that basic mechanics of an input and output and a storage element, what we have on the hillside as a civilization, what you have in the bank yourself, those parallels hold. What is it about agriculture that essentially changed the relationship between soil production and soil loss on the surface of the earth? Well, you can trace it back essentially to the invention of the plow. It's that iconic invention that, when we think of, you turn on a country music radio station, if anyone here does that, and enjoy it as much as I do at times, you will hear, if someone's running through the icons of things, what do farmers do? They plow. It's this iconic symbol of agriculture. But what does it do to the land? It basically leaves the land bare and vulnerable to erosion for some part of the year. It turns the earth. It's intended to suppress weeds and prepare the seedbed. And it's actually really useful for those processes. But if you have, say, a good rainstorm right after you've plowed, you can literally lose a century's worth of soil in an afternoon. And if that goes on for centuries, periodically, every now and then, not every day, of course, but at a slow rate, it can really add up over time, as I'll be sharing. And so the invention of the plow fundamentally altered the balance between soil production and soil erosion on our agricultural lands, the very lands that we need the most to maintain the physical presence of soil as a fertile body. And if we look at examples for that, I could run you through a whole bunch of them. I'm just going to do a couple. We're going to start with classical Greece. And why classical Greece? Well, because geologists and archaeologists have done the work that I could go find and synthesize. Much of what I'm going to be talking about today is not my own research. It's a synthetic effort. I've drawn on the work of many other people to try and put this story together. But when you go look at classical Greece, and you look at the history of the Greek landscape, you can document that cycles of soil erosion and soil formation began right about at the time of the Bronze Age introduction of plow-based agriculture. When the plow came from sources to the east and arrived in the Greek landscape, at the time it was open oak woodland. This is a cross-section. You're looking at the cross-section across a hillside that Tjeerd Van Andel and Chris Reynolds put together back in the 1980s. And so if you read that, it's the top of the hill over on the left, bottom river valley down at the bottom right. And those vertical stripes show you essentially the thickness of soil. And typically, the typical thickness on a typical hillside around the world is somewhere between 1 and 3 feet. So a fraction of a third of a meter to about a meter of soil on a natural hill slope is what you'd find in the UN Global Soil Database as sort of the average. And the Greek landscape had a soil mantled cover with open oak woodland that we know of from reconstruction from pollen records from lakes. You can kind of reconstruct what the vegetation is in the region. And this is what Van Andel and Reynolds suggested that the Greek landscape looked like at the time between the end of the Ice Age and the arrival of the plow. What then happened is that cultivation spread up onto the hillsides. Typically in societies, the river valleys are the first to be plowed and planted. Why? Well, it's sort of flat, well-watered, easily worked land right by a river. That's where you would start. As populations grow, farming tends to spread up into the upland environments, and by the peak of the Bronze Age culture in classical Greece, farming had spread from the river valleys up onto the hillsides. And so you had cultivated fields across the landscape, and erosion started to outpace the pace of soil production. What they worked out was that over time, the soil that had been on the hillsides ended up down in the valley bottoms. Some of it slid off, like is illustrated here. Some of it eroded off fairly slowly. But if you think of, and you can still find areas today in the Greek landscape where you can find Bronze Age agricultural implements up on hillsides that have been essentially eroded down to virtually bare rocky soils, or the bare rock, the remnants of soils. Not places you could actually farm today. And if you think about the problem of how you actually support a population through agriculture, it turns out that if you take a thin layer of soil that has a large surface area you could work, and you erode it off and stack it all up in the valley bottoms in a small area, even if the volume of soil in the landscape remains the same, it's the surface area that matters in terms of how much you can actually work. If you strip it off and put it in a deep pile, then you could maybe work it for longer, but you're not going to be able to support as many people with as extensive a farm. So that's essentially what Van Andel and Reynolds argued happened to the Greek landscape, although they didn't quite frame it the same way. They did, though, look at the population density of the southern Argolid, the particular region in southern Greece. And this is the graph from their work that really got me started in thinking about the kind of direction that I went with the background research in putting this book together. And what it shows you is the population in this area ranging from 6,000 BC over there on the left over to the contemporary world on the right. And there's two interesting features to a graph like this. And you notice each of one of those black dots is a point in time where they felt through the geoarchaeological work that they did that they could constrain this kind of an estimate. And you'll notice that the curve sort of starts low at the start of the Bronze Age, it rises to the Bronze Age, it drops into a dark age before the age of classical Greece, the population goes back up again, it drops again for another dark age before the modern age. And of course the question that you might be asking yourself, seeing a pattern like this, is what's going to happen over on the next thing to the right. But there's two aspects to a graph like this that I found really interesting. Well, one was really interesting, one is actually fairly trivial. The trivial one is, why does the amplitude of that signal go up with each cycle? You know, in the Bronze Age it's lower, it goes up in the Classical Age, the Modern Age is higher, and the simple answer to that is technology. Agricultural technology that we have today is far more sophisticated than what they had in the Bronze Age. There's no mystery about that. You can support more people on the same side from the same size farmland today than you could 6,000 years ago. There should be no mystery about that. The part that intrigued me about this graph is what sets the periodicity. Why this rise, fall, rise, fall, rise, and then, as I mentioned, what's going to happen off to the right-hand side? Why does it take a few thousand years in between civilizations being able to apparently reoccupy the same bit of landscape? That was the question that got me wondering, well, could soil loss and soil erosion does it occur at a pace that is actually commensurate with pointing to a figure like this and inferring some kind of a causal link. Now, of course, there were not geomorphologists running around in the Bronze Age trying to measure soil loss off of fields and publish it in obscure academic journals. There's not that much data that we can go to outside of the triangulation of the geoarchaeological world, which is the kind of data I was just showing you. But that doesn't mean people weren't paying attention. Plato, back in the 3rd century BC, the classical Greek philosopher, noticed the problem of soil erosion off the Greek landscape. He was looking at the evidence for the Bronze Age soil erosion event when he wrote in one of his dialogues that the rich soft soil has all run away, leaving the land nothing but skin and bone. But in those days the damage had not taken place. The hills had high crests, the rocky plain of Phelus was covered with rich soil, and the mountains were covered by thick woods, of which there are some traces today. He was looking at things like olive trees on the pillars around where the farmers had plowed. The Greeks were very into plowing their fields. And Plato made the argument quite explicitly that the Greek landscape in his day, at the age of classical Greece, was not able to support the same populations that could support the same size armies as they had in prior days because of the loss of soil off of the landscape, as he was describing here. As far as I can tell, he's the first person to explicitly make the argument that the way that people treat land, in the end, sets how the land will be able to treat a society. He didn't get full credit, I think, for this idea for many years until the geoarchaeological work was done thousands of years after his time, in part because he wrote about this in the same dialogue that he discussed the history of Atlantis. It was not viewed as the most credible source in the classical world for that reason. Now, if we leave the Greeks and we go to the Roman civilization, we can also make a tie between soil erosion and then sort of the history of classical Rome. There's a Princeton University professor, Sheldon Judson, who back in the 1960s apparently really liked to go to Italy and do his summer field work there, and he did a fair amount of work looking at studying erosion rates in antiquity off of the Roman heartland in that area of central Italy. What he's able to document was that erosion rates in the Roman heartland increased by an order of magnitude starting in about the 2nd century BC. And how did he do this? Well, he did things like he went to Roman monuments where the foundations were now exposed. And what's the one thing you don't do when you build a foundation? You don't build it above ground, you build it below ground. That's the whole point of a foundation. So if you go around to classical monuments that we know the date that they were actually built in, you measure the height distance between the top of the foundation and the modern soil, you can constrain how much soil has been lost since the thing was built. It's a pretty good indicator. The other way you can do it is you can drill cores into lakes, radiocarbon date the different layers, back out how much was going in from a known area contributing to the lake, and figure out the erosion rate. He did things like that. It's the kind of stuff geologists like myself would do. But that doesn't answer the question of, okay, well, what happened in the 2nd century BC? And the short answer is that Roman agriculture changed in a very profound way about this time. Prior to this period, Roman farms were primarily small-scale polycultural farms that practically had multiple canopy, diverse crops, and in the 2nd century BC, you might recall the wars with Carthage that Rome had, where they sort of went after their geopolitical rival across the Mediterranean. And you've probably all heard the stories that the Romans, when they sacked Carthage, they salted the soil to famously try and keep it from being farmed. What you don't hear that much about is that they also brought several 100,000 slaves back to central Italy, and it totally changed Roman farming. It went from being small-scale farms to very large-scale monocultural plantations, a transition in agriculture that might sound fairly similar to what's happened in the United States over the course of our recent history. What did this do to the landscape? It started erosion rates coming at a much higher rate than had been happening before. And what you don't hear in the history of Rome so much is that by about the 1st through 3rd centuries AD, just about 300-400 years after the sacking of Carthage and the fundamental change in Roman agriculture, the fields of central Italy were no longer able to feed the populace in Rome. It was North Africa and Egypt that were essentially the essential sources for feeding Rome in the late days of the empire. In fact, it was a capital offense to actually interfere with the grain shipments from North Africa to central Italy because the political stability of Rome depended upon free bread and circus in the capital. So the 1 million people or so in the capital in Rome were being fed by farms in Africa. In other words, the Romans went back and started working the fields they had salted several centuries before to feed the late stages of their empire. So it was the extensive olive and cereal plantations in Africa that were supporting Rome near the end of its days. And again, this is not new. This is not new information. There's a gentleman named Walter Loudermilk, who was a Soil Conservation Service scientist back in the 1930s through 50s, who, in the days before the Second World War, got very interested in the aftermath of the Dust Bowl about what had happened to soils in the classical world. And he took a tour from the Middle East across North Africa into Southern Europe, trying to look at the state of soils and what had happened to societies that had, in his view, abused their soils in the past. And when he went to North Africa and to Timgad in Libya, he found that the second largest city of the Roman Empire that day, if I'm recalling this correctly, a city that had 60,000, 70,000 people in it at its peak and was surrounded by rich agricultural fields, when Loudermilk visited it right before the Second World War, he couldn't find any soil on the hillsides. In his words, he wrote that over a large part of the ancient granary of Rome, we found the soil washed off to bedrock and the hills seriously gullied as a result of overgrazing. He also found some olive plantations where the soil had been protected on the hillsides, where where you could still grow crops, and he therefore concluded that it hadn't been a climate shift that had destroyed agriculture in northern Africa, but it was essentially the long-term loss of the soil that had prevented its productivity.